Welcome to the Boys Turner podcast. I am Rowan Turrell and I'm the Head of Dispute Resolution at Boys Turner. This special edition of our podcast comes from the Caledonian Club in London, where we've been holding an event called Building Growth and Efficiency for In-House Legal Teams. This episode is going to give you a taste of one of the 3 panel sessions that took place today, which was called The Impact of M&A Activity on In-House Teams, the Good, the Bad and the Ugly. It was hosted by Dobson, who is a partner in our corporate team, and it featured Mark Blunden, who is the General Counsel and Vice President EMEA at Culligan, and Barbara Keane, who is the General Counsel at Origin Enterprises. In a moment, you will hear from the panellists as they reflect on their earlier conversation. But first, here are some highlights from the event itself.
Okay, thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed the first session and feeling a little bit intimidated now to live up to how interesting the chat was on the last one, actually. So, my name is Dobson. I'm a corporate partner at Boys Turner. Bit of a self-confessed M&A nerd. I'm very conscious that my involvement in the work kind of, it ends really at completion. And so I'm not best placed to have a view on the various integration that needs to go on post-completion. And equally, the early stage strategic conversations within the business that lead up to the point in time when I get called and asked to advise on my legals, which in the timeline of an M&A transaction, again, I appreciate that my work is very compressed and comes along right at the end of the process. And there's lots of stuff going on before then. So on that basis, very fortunate to have my 2 guests next to me here who are very, very experienced commercial lawyers in their own rights, but have equally got lots of experience in terms of being in the box seat within business for M&A activity. Reading really about the evolving role and expectations on in-house legal teams in businesses going forwards. In-house lawyers wanting to break out from a perception of being just a function, and we go to legal, we go to HR for these particular points as and when a crisis or a particular issue comes up, to perhaps moving along to actually being a wider part of wider business strategic decision making. If I go to you, Mark, what's your perception of the mindset of internal stakeholders that you have within Culligan as to your role within an M&A transaction? When does that start?
It's quite interesting. It's been eye-opening for me, having been in sort of private practice and been quite segmented in my approach for many years, is getting the business to actually work with the legal team, and you get involved, not necessarily dispensing sage legal advice. And I think this is the kind of the key to what Barbara is actually sort of driving at. It's being involved from the very outset in terms of how things are shaped commercially. I mean, I never thought I'd have to have any great appreciation on the finance tax structuring. I found it very stretching going into this environment, and I think that's where you transition out of just being sort of the legal dispenser of advice to being part of that wider management team. You need to be part of those conversations in the room when transactions are being planned and structured. I spend more time on structural issues actually than on execution of transactions. And I think that's where they perceive the value, both at the front end and then also, and the challenge is making sure you remain involved in the process. Once completion has been and gone, actually it's that longer term journey, that integration of the business, both from the existing company's perspective, but also how do you then drive the benefit from the deal, from the acquisition? How do you bring those people into the wider organisation? Yes, some of it comes back to how we structure it, and that can be a challenge, and we'll probably talk about that. But actually, you need to be part of that full journey process and try and break out of a purely legal box, because otherwise you can be kind of perceived as just being sort of a well somebody goes to for a legal answer and nothing more. And it's quite hard to achieve that.
Barbara, if I can put it to you, it's a big one, I guess. But kind of from your experience in M&A to date, what have been the key learning points for you, and and things that you'll look to try and take forwards going forwards that you've learned?
Yes, right, lots of things. Well, Look, maybe just coming back to the point again about how you're set up and you're structured. This isn't so much a big picture maybe piece, but I would say I have seen it being really important to leverage off your prior deals, your prior knowledge, your learnings, because suddenly you're asked to ramp up, and I'd say this is where we were talking. It's a little bit different, Our team is doing everything from an M&A deal to every other issue under the sun. And so you've got to have tools at your disposal so that you can get on top of things quickly, because I think pressure builds when you have a sense of being out of control, when you don't have a plan. And so if you have resources that you can draw on, and that can be playbooks, it can be processes, it can be checklists, it can be templates, and it can just be your engagement throughout the process. But you need to have them and you need to draw on them. And I think, at whatever point in time is the optimal time to do that and to capture that, it will stand to you. Okay.
Mark, same question to you.
Same. In some respects, yeah, absolutely. I think the trick is also, I would say slow the process down, but cause people to actually pause and consider what they're doing and why they're doing it. There's always this great kind of incentive to kind of charge ahead and do the next great big deal. And where I've seen things go wrong is that there hasn't been adequate kind of pause for thought and consideration of what it is. It's not necessarily just the financial planning, it's that bigger picture in terms of trying to get the business to engage and think, why are we doing this? Is this the right thing to be doing at the time? Because actually, if you do a lot of deals, you can end up buying something that you really shouldn't have bought, and it goes horribly wrong. But yeah, absolutely, having a clear program process, and actually it comes back to where you started, having the team, the support team that know what they're doing, particularly if you're doing repeated deals.
Okay, and last, probably possibly silly one, but again, talking of experiences to date, what's been your biggest kind of nightmarish completion experience in terms of kind of like past, well beyond midnight, or it's gone on for days, weeks, months? What's been the most fraught one you've had?
Well, I'll maybe start at the other end of the question.
Or best. Yeah.
I think when we've run into late pressured issues, what we've probably, realised the next time is, it's an age-old thing, but, early visibility and early identification of issues so that you can resolve them as early as possible in the solution will reap benefits. And, I think we worked on a transaction a number of years ago where there was a structural change at the end, very, very close to completion, was throwing out the timing. It was because the sellers, it was for tax reasons, which is obviously not unusual, but it came up very late in the day. And I suppose when that does happen, it did slow us down a little bit, but we moved as quickly as possible. And that was certainly, Chris, that was the 2 a.m.s, right? But, that informed the next one I think we did, because, it's not something that we could have picked up early on, but it's something we're alive to. And so when you have any of those things that are going to trip you up near the end, when the pressure is really on, when financials think the deal is done, and it's like, why are we still negotiating an SPA? It's get these issues on the table and dealt with early, escalate early, find solutions early, just to give yourself the best chance of not being the one, certainly to be perceived to be holding up a deal.
So we've just finished our panel session and wanted to come back and discuss in a little bit more detail some of the points that we found particularly interesting and to go through them in a little bit more detail now. And for me personally, the point that I was particularly interested in was the wider point around how the expected function of an in-house legal team within business is now perhaps moving away from being a simple provider of legal output, and we have a legal issue, we have a legal problem that needs to be resolved, do it, to now hopefully the evolution and development of the legal function in-house to being a team of commercial advisors that can add some strategic input to the wider business and not necessarily just legal. Would you be able to expand on your thoughts that you shared earlier in a little bit more detail, please, Barbara?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, ultimately, obviously, the documentation is going to be run out of legal. So you're never going to be in a position where you can turn around and say, well, that's not really a legal point. That's dealt with by someone else. You've got to know what it's about. You've got to know how it's being shaped for the transaction, what the issues are, whether that is much broader than just legal. You've got to understand it's going to end up at your doorstep. I think even then from the legal perspective itself, you've got to be able to drill down and cut through the swathes of information that is going to be built up during the transaction to get to the core issues. And they can be across the whole breadth of the business. And, you'll need to identify them. You may not be the person working out the exact solution, but you'll own probably the process around that. And you'll certainly own and need to stand up to how that gets then ultimately resolved in a document that gets signed for the transaction.
No, absolutely. And we covered it a little bit earlier on as well, Mark, the concept of, obviously, you've got to be a generalist as an in-house lawyer. And then the relationship you have with external advisors coming in, who are the specialists in the areas, and also the relationship you have with internal stakeholders who have got their own specialisms and areas that they're working on. So how do you find your role as essentially kind of a project manager, generalist?
The legal role's definitely evolved. It's more of a people management skills role. So yes, you've got the specialist knowledge from your core disciplines, but you're having to integrate with people with lots of very detailed knowledge in their own right. I'm finding I'm dealing a lot with finance and tax people on the one hand, which at the start of transactions you're planning, structuring, looking at complexities in that regard, all the way through the spectrum to having to deal with very much the people aspects. And again, the people element of any transaction when your business is absolutely critical, be it goods or services. These businesses all need people, and when you're buying businesses, you're buying staff. You're having to integrate with your HR advisors internally as well as the transactional teams to understand what they're going to do with people post-transaction, manage expectations, and some of these are quite complex processes, particularly in places where you've got unionised arrangements with staff. When you're looking to bring businesses together culturally, elements like branding and marketing, so you're dealing with sort of all the way through from the finance, the people, the marketing teams. So you have to be able to work across the whole breadth of the business, be seen to be a credible advisor, to be able to engage with people in their own area of expertise, but also act as the bridge between them.
I was having a conversation with someone recently, and I was discussing the point that I find quite interesting, that in my own role, quite often actually, I need to delegate work down to individuals who are the experts on particular points that I can't add genuine value to myself. Yeah, I need to manage them, and I need to look at it as the skill I'm trying to impart in this process is to know what are the right questions to ask. How does this particular person like to be managed, and how can we facilitate the process so that we're expunging the right information from them at the right time? And that's just within a legal context. Do you find you have to go through the same process with internal stakeholders within the business?
Yeah, and look, I think this is where the relationship piece comes in because, I think invariably in a transaction, you're going to have key stakeholders, finance team, absolutely key, your executives probably as well. And I think other stakeholders will largely probably mirror your due diligence work streams, but they may have different prominence depending on the nature of the deal. And so I think hopefully by the time you're kind of coming into a transaction, ideally you have a good working relationship already and you have built up that credibility that we talk about. By the time then you're starting to talk about the new transaction. I think, when you see people who are performing very well in an in-house role, they are good at asking the right questions. They are, and part of that is the understanding that you have of the business, the context for which an acquisition or another transaction may be being done, and how the target or other entity fits within the strategy of the business. Because then I think it's going to inform how you interact with those stakeholders, what the issues you know are going to be the areas of focus. And, you know, it's about, you know, early engaging with those stakeholders, bring them in early, work with them, give them a bit of ownership of their issues, but you can't get away from yourself having to be able to cut through to the core issues, because, you know, if there's X hundred of issues on the table at the start, which are the ones that you would be happy for example, your executives to see at the end of it, you know, and so they might be important in a HR context or in a data protection context, but in the scale of the whole transaction, you know, you have to make that call and that judgment call about what makes it through to the end in terms of priority.
Yeah, and it's a common theme that is coming across from all of our discussions here is the central importance of people, you know, of managing people, whether it's your internal stakeholders during the acquisition process itself, whether it's managing the relationship with your external advisors. And a point I'd just like to have a look at now that we were talking about earlier on, Mark, was the importance of the ongoing relationship and developing the relationship with the people that have come across from the transaction, whether it might be the entrepreneurial owners of the business or indeed more junior members of staff that have come across and have landed within your organisation post completion. Can you just expand a little bit or more on what we discussed earlier, the importance of that particular point as a post-deal integration?
Sure, Chris. I think it's a question of that wider integration piece. So how do people get brought into the organisation, made to feel part of a business that's acquired where they've been employed? I think it can be quite a sensitive time for people. There's always a lot of uncertainty as to whether people retain their roles. The types of schemes you put in place, and it's not uncommon to put in retention type arrangements to keep sort of employees of targets that have been acquired, and then the broader cultural integration. But also, and we touched on this earlier, the way the transactions are structured will materially impact on how this can be done. If acquisition targets have to be ring-fenced for financial calibration perspective, earnouts and the like, it's much harder. So when we're actually looking at structuring transactions at the outset, we need to think about how this full integration process will work. And is there an intention, for example, that the MD would be left running his own business division? Would he keep running that same business? Would he have the same management team around him? Would they be blended with other people within the existing organisation? Can you migrate people into the wider organisation to expand their career kind of ambitions and bring that to the fore to try and actually kind of integrate it, which it's easier said than done because people invariably are quite reticent and nervous in any of these transactional situations.
Yeah, I know. I flagged it earlier on that, as you know, I'm a bit of a nerd with the processes, and the question was asked about what's the main area of negotiation, and I think we all kind of came to the same conclusion that, as you were saying a minute ago, it's an earn-out situation. It's where we have sellers who are going to stay on with the business after the event, and for me, the tension that exists between the shared opportunities for both sides, and the inherent and understandable concern that any seller might have that they've given up the keys to their house. It's gone off to the big bad corporate buyer, and actually they're going to be doing everything they can to try and turn one over them and resist paying them out more consideration. And you mentioned it earlier, Barbara, that you're seeing at the moment a key characteristic of transactions recently have been earnouts, have been a big deal for you guys. And so is that a trend that you're expecting to see to continue, and an area that you think you might have kind of nailed down in terms of the process of managing these people during the process, or is it still an area where there's work that can be done?
I think it will remain a very topical issue, a very sensitive issue and a personal issue when certainly the profile of the acquisitions that you're making involves sellers who are founders or owners of the business. And I think, you know, the other piece as well, I suppose, that we have seen is where the brand is very important to that profile of seller. And, you know, part of, I suppose, in looking at the synergies, there is an acceptance that in the earn-out type of scenario that you're going to have to maybe, you plan ahead for it. Certainly you see where the target sits within your group in the future. But you have to, I suppose, and you'll have identified the synergies and the integration piece there, but you have to be able to, I suppose, stand back, allow the target to do the job that it has done and the reason why you're acquiring it, and then bring it forward. So give it the benefits almost of being part of that broader corporate group, and support it. And, you know, the integration piece that comes in the future, well, you've probably identified early on whether that MD is going to be a part of that future or not. And you draw then on your existing models for other parts of your business where you have to make a connection between an operating division and, let's say, the core corporate group. And how do you manage the connections and the links there? And you draw on those models. So one of the ones, Mark, was the one you mentioned, for example, around maybe remuneration, you know, and incentivizing people. And how are you going to incentivize people to stay? What's your retention going to look like? But not all of these sellers will ultimately want to stay as well. If they're entrepreneurial in nature, they will want to move on after their earn-out.
Yeah, great. Well, look, my thanks again to Barbara Keane and to Mark Blunden for joining me on the session today. Really enjoyed it. Hopefully it was interesting for all who listened. And thanks very much.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
And that was Chris Dobson talking to Barbara Keane, General Counsel for Origin Enterprises, and Mark Blunden, Vice President and General Counsel, EMEA at Culligan. Thanks to you for listening, and you can follow or subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you want any more information about us, then please go to boysturner.com. Goodbye.